Cinecittà Studios, Rome. March 14, 1960. 4:15 a.m. The Cleopatra set was empty. Filming wouldn't start for 3 more hours. But Elizabeth Taylor couldn't sleep, so she wandered through the costume department. That's when she heard it, quiet sobbing coming from a back room. She found Catherine Williams, the head costume designer, sitting on the floor surrounded by golden fabrics and beads, holding a telegram with shaking hands. The telegram was from a London hospital. It said Catherine's 8-year-old daughter had 6 weeks to live without experimental treatment that cost more than Catherine would earn in 10 years. Elizabeth sat down on that floor beside her. And what happened in the next 72 hours saved a child's life, bankrupted Elizabeth's, Cleopatra, earnings, and stayed completely secret until 1995, when Emma Williams opened a safety deposit box her mother left behind. Before I share this incredible story with you, if you want to discover the most touching moments from the golden era of entertainment, real stories of humanity, and the unknown sides of legends from the 1950s through 1980s, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Because the story I'm going to tell you today isn't just about a movie star and a costume designer. It's about motherhood, sacrifice, and the kind of generosity that changes lives forever. Catherine Williams was 34 years old in 1960. She'd been working in costume design for 12 years, starting as an apprentice seamstress in London's West End theaters. She was talented, meticulous, and passionate about her craft. By 1959, she'd earned a reputation as one of the most skilled costume designers in England. When 20th Century Fox announced they were making Cleopatra, the most ambitious and expensive film in history, Catherine was recruited for the costume team. It was the opportunity of a lifetime. The pay was good, $75 a week, which was substantial for 1960. More importantly, the film was scheduled to shoot for 6 months in Rome. Catherine saw it as a chance to save money, advance her career, and secure a better future for her daughter, Emma. Emma was 8 years old, bright and healthy, living with Catherine's mother in London while Catherine worked abroad. It seemed like a perfect plan. But in January 1960, everything changed. Catherine received a phone call from her mother. Emma had been feeling tired for weeks, running low fevers, bruising easily. The doctors had run tests. The diagnosis was acute lymphoblastic leukemia, an aggressive form of childhood cancer. Without treatment, Emma had months to live. With standard treatment, chemotherapy, and radiation, she might have a year, maybe 2. But there was an experimental treatment being developed at Great Ormond Street Hospital in London. A new protocol combining different drugs. Early trials showed promise. Some children were going into remission. The cost was devastating. For £1,000. In 1960, that was equivalent to about $11,000. More than Catherine would earn in 2 years. Her mother's savings were £300. Catherine had 200. They were 4,000 short with no way to get it. Banks wouldn't loan to a single mother with no collateral. The hospital required payment upfront before starting the experimental protocol. Catherine made a choice that would haunt her for months. She stayed in Rome. She kept working on Cleopatra, because if she quit, she'd have no income at all. At least if she kept working, she could send money home for Emma's standard treatment. Maybe, somehow, she could save enough for the experimental protocol. It was a desperate, impossible hope, but it was all she had. For 2 months, Catherine worked like a woman possessed. She took every overtime shift. She volunteered for the most difficult, time-consuming costumes. She worked 18, sometimes 20 hours a day, hand-sewing thousands of beads and jewels onto Cleopatra's elaborate costumes. The film's costume budget was massive, but the timeline was brutal. Everything had to be perfect, and everything had to be done immediately. Elizabeth Taylor had been cast as Cleopatra with an unprecedented contract, $1 million. The first time any actor had been paid that much for a single film. The production was chaotic, over budget, and constantly delayed. Elizabeth herself was often ill, suffering from various ailments that halted filming for days or weeks at a time. But when she was on set, she was professional, focused, and kind to the crew. Catherine had minimal direct contact with Elizabeth during fittings. Their interactions were brief and professional. Elizabeth would stand on a platform while Catherine and her team made adjustments, pinning fabric, checking hemlines. Elizabeth was always polite, always patient, even during the lengthy fitting sessions that could last hours. But Catherine was drowning. Every week, she'd call London and hear her mother's voice, strained, exhausted, trying to sound hopeful. Emma was getting weaker. The standard treatment was slowing the cancer, but not stopping it. They needed the experimental protocol. They needed £4,000. and Catherine was nowhere close. By March, Catherine had saved $800. She was sending almost everything home, living on bread and coffee, sleeping 4 hours a night. But it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. The doctor said Emma had weeks, not months. The experimental treatment was her only chance, and Catherine couldn't provide it. On March 13, 1960, Catherine received a telegram at the studio. Emma had been hospitalized. Her condition was deteriorating. The doctors gave her 6 weeks without the experimental protocol. 6 weeks. Catherine read that telegram during a lunch break, sitting alone in the costume department, and something inside her broke. She'd failed. She'd sacrificed everything, left her dying daughter, worked herself to exhaustion, and it hadn't mattered. She didn't have the money. She'd never have the money. That night, Catherine stayed late at the studio. She couldn't go back to her tiny rented room. She couldn't face the silence, the helplessness. So she sat on the floor of the costume workshop, surrounded by unfinished Cleopatra gowns, and she cried. Deep, silent sobs that shook her entire body. She didn't hear Elizabeth Taylor enter the workshop at 4:15 a.m. Elizabeth couldn't sleep that night. Insomnia was common for her during stressful productions, and Cleopatra was the most stressful of her career. She'd wandered through the empty studio, walking through the massive Egyptian sets, trying to clear her mind. Then she'd heard something. Crying. Quiet but unmistakable. She followed the sound to the costume department. The door was open. Inside, sitting on the floor surrounded by golden fabric and scattered beads, was Catherine Williams. She was holding a piece of paper, a telegram, and crying like her heart was shattering. Elizabeth stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure whether to intrude. Then she stepped inside and said softly, "Catherine." Catherine looked up, startled. Her face was blotchy and wet with tears. She tried to stand, to compose herself, but her legs wouldn't work. "Miss Taylor, I'm so sorry. I didn't know anyone was." "Don't apologize," Elizabeth said gently. She walked over and, without hesitation, sat down on the floor beside Catherine. Not above her. Not standing. She sat right there on the concrete floor, in her silk robe, and said, "What's wrong?" Catherine tried to deflect. "It's nothing. Personal matter. I'll be fine for the fitting tomorrow." "Catherine." Elizabeth's voice was firm but kind. "I'm not asking as Cleopatra. I'm asking as a woman. What's wrong?" And Catherine, exhausted and broken, told her everything. She told her about Emma, about the leukemia, about the experimental treatment, about the 4,000 pounds she couldn't raise, about the 6 weeks her daughter had left. She told Elizabeth everything because she had nothing left to lose. Elizabeth listened without interrupting. When Catherine finished, there was a long silence. Then Elizabeth said, "How much do you need?" "Exactly. For 1,000 pounds, Catherine whispered. "But Miss Taylor, I wasn't asking for." "I know you weren't," Elizabeth said. "But I'm giving it. And I'm doing it right now." Catherine stared at her. "I can't accept that. It's too much. I could never repay." "I'm not asking you to repay it," Elizabeth said firmly. "Catherine, I'm a mother. I have 3 children. If one of them were dying and I couldn't afford treatment, I'd lose my mind. You've been working 20-hour days, living on nothing, sending every penny home. You've done everything you possibly could, but you can't do this alone. So I'm going to help, and I don't want to hear another word about repayment." Catherine broke down completely. Elizabeth put her arm around Catherine's shoulders and let her cry. They sat there on the floor of the costume workshop for almost an hour, 2 women bound by motherhood, surrounded by the glittering costumes of ancient Egypt. The next morning, March 14th, Elizabeth called her business manager in Los Angeles. She instructed him to wire 4,000 pounds immediately to Great Ormond Street Hospital in London, designated for Emma Williams's experimental treatment protocol. Then she called the hospital directly and spoke to the head of oncology. She confirmed the treatment could begin immediately upon receipt of payment and asked the doctor to call Catherine as soon as Emma was admitted to the program. By noon on March 15th, Emma Williams was starting the experimental protocol. Catherine received the call while working on a Cleopatra headdress. She collapsed, not from grief this time, but from overwhelming relief. Her daughter had a chance, a real chance. Elizabeth didn't tell anyone what she'd done. She didn't announce it to the press, didn't mention it to the producers. She simply continued working on Cleopatra as if nothing had happened. But she made Catherine promise something. When Emma recovers, and she will recover, you're going to tell her this story. You're going to tell her that when life knocks you down, sometimes an angel appears. And you're going to teach her to be that angel for someone else. The experimental treatment worked. Emma responded better than doctors hoped. Within 3 months, she was in remission. Within 6 months, the cancer was undetectable. Emma Williams survived. She grew up healthy, became a teacher, married, had children of her own. Catherine finished working on Cleopatra. The film was released in 1963 and became one of the most famous movies in history. Catherine's costume work was spectacular, though she received little public recognition. After Cleopatra, she continued working in film for another 15 years before retiring in 1975. She never told anyone about Elizabeth's gift. She'd promised Elizabeth she wouldn't. Elizabeth had been clear. This isn't charity. This isn't publicity. This is one mother helping another. That's all. And that's private. Catherine kept that promise for 35 years. She never spoke about it publicly, never wrote about it, never told journalists or historians who asked about working with Elizabeth Taylor. She kept the secret until her death in 1995. But before she died, Catherine wrote a letter. She wrote it to Emma, now 43 years old with children of her own. Catherine sealed the letter in a safety deposit box along with a copy of the hospital payment record showing Elizabeth Taylor's wire transfer. She instructed her lawyer to give the box to Emma after Catherine's death. Emma received the box in May 1995. When she opened it and read her mother's letter, she cried for 3 hours. The letter explained everything. The telegram, the desperate night in the costume workshop, Elizabeth sitting on the floor, the wire transfer that saved Emma's life. Catherine's letter ended with these words. Emma, you're alive because Elizabeth Taylor gave your mother £4,000 without hesitation, without publicity, without expecting anything in return. She did it because she was a mother who understood what another mother was facing. I promised her I'd never tell this story publicly while she was alive. But Elizabeth passed away in March 2011. And now you need to know. You need to know that your life was saved by one of the most famous women in the world, who used her fortune not for glamour or luxury, but to save a child she'd never met. Elizabeth made me promise to teach you something. When you have the power to help, you help. No questions. No hesitation. You just help. That's what angels do. Emma Williams went public with the story in 1996. She contacted Elizabeth Taylor biographers and historians, providing the letter, the hospital records, and her own testimony. The story was published in several books about Elizabeth's life, but it never received widespread attention. Elizabeth had died 5 years earlier, so she never knew the story had been revealed. But those who knew Elizabeth weren't surprised, because this wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout her life, Elizabeth Taylor quietly helped people. She donated millions to AIDS research through her foundation. She paid hospital bills for strangers. She helped crew members, assistants, and colleagues in financial crisis. Most of these acts were never publicized because Elizabeth didn't want publicity. She wanted to help. What makes this story remarkable isn't just the generosity. Though £4,000 in 1960 was substantial, even for someone earning Elizabeth's salary. What makes it remarkable is the humanity. Elizabeth Taylor, at the height of her fame, sitting on a concrete floor at 4 a.m. with a costume designer she barely knew. Listening, really listening, and then acting immediately, without hesitation, because a child's life was at stake. In 1960, Elizabeth was under immense pressure. Cleopatra was over budget, behind schedule, and plagued with problems. Elizabeth herself was dealing with health issues, media scrutiny, and a complicated personal life. She had every reason to be self-absorbed, to focus only on her own challenges. But when she found Catherine crying on that floor, Elizabeth didn't see a costume designer. She saw a mother, and she responded the way she'd want someone to respond if their positions were reversed. Emma Williams is 73 years old now, as of 2024. She's a retired teacher living in Surrey, England. She has 3 children and 7 grandchildren. She survived leukemia, lived a full life, and raised a family. And every year on March 15th, the day she started the experimental treatment, Emma donates to childhood cancer research in Elizabeth Taylor's name. I never met Elizabeth Taylor, Emma says. I was 8 years old, dying in a hospital, and I didn't know she existed. But she knew I existed. She knew a mother was desperate to save her daughter. And she acted. No cameras, no press, no recognition, just pure human compassion. That's the Elizabeth Taylor the world should remember. This story reminds us that true greatness has nothing to do with fame or fortune. It has to do with how you use your power when no one is watching. Elizabeth Taylor could have walked past that costume workshop. She could have ignored the crying. She could have offered sympathy and moved on. But she didn't. She sat down on the floor. She listened. And she gave everything she'd earned on Cleopatra, Her entire $1 million salary went to taxes, agent fees, expenses, and gifts like this to save a child's life. Catherine Williams worked on dozens of films after Cleopatra. She designed costumes for major productions and trained young designers. But she always said the most important thing she ever made wasn't a costume. It was the promise she kept to Elizabeth Taylor. The promise to teach Emma that when you have the power to help, you help. No questions. No hesitation. You just help. And Emma kept that promise too. She became a teacher, spending 40 years educating children, many from underprivileged backgrounds. She volunteered at hospitals. She mentored young mothers facing impossible situations. And she always told them the same thing. An angel helped my mother when we had nothing. Now I'm paying it forward. That's what we do. We help. The safety deposit box that contained Catherine's letter also contained something else. A small note, handwritten by Elizabeth Taylor, that Catherine had kept for 35 years. It said, "Dear Catherine, Emma will be fine. I know it. And when she grows up, tell her that her mother is a hero. Love, Elizabeth." Emma still has that note. It sits in a frame in her living room, next to a photo of her mother and a photo of Elizabeth Taylor as Cleopatra. Three women connected by a moment of grace in a costume workshop at 4 a.m., when one mother helped another save her daughter's life and expected nothing in return but the promise that kindness would continue. That's the Elizabeth Taylor the world needs to remember. Not just the violet eyes or the diamonds or the 8 marriages, but the woman who sat on a concrete floor at 4 a.m. and said, "I'm a mother too, and I'm going to help." The woman who gave her fortune to save a stranger's child. The woman who understood that real beauty isn't what you look like. It's what you do when someone needs you.